Sego Skanagoa, Golong Scott Stevens, Young Yachts. That is a greeting in Mohawk, my mother's people. Um, I grew up in Western New York as a citizen of the Mohawk Nation, but knowing very well I was on the traditional territories of Seneca and Tuscarora people. And I loved that experience because we're all Haudenosaunee people together, and that fellowship was central to framing my identity and my sense of self. Um, and my interest in the kind of longue durée of the cultural interaction between our peoples. My father was of Welsh descent. His parents were from coal country in Pennsylvania. My mother's people from Akwesasne, Mohawk, up near Messina, and her dad from Grand River Reservation at Brantford, Ontario. But to us, this was our homeland and still is. And I want to reflect on the long interaction between Europeans and Native people, Haudenosaunee people particularly. And so I'm delighted to be here and accept this invitation from the organizers of the event. It moved around a lot because of COVID, and I sometimes wondered if it would come to be, but I'm happy that it has. So, for Native people, Haudenosaunee people, Mohawk people, we didn't encounter Shakespeare in the 19th century. We encountered him back in the 18th century when a delegation of Mohawk men went to the court of Queen Anne, and someone decided it would be a great idea to take them to a performance of Macbeth. Right? I don't know what they made of the play. They probably had deep suspicions about European notions of hospitality based on the play. Um, it was interrupted during the play because the playhouse owner had advertised in advance that Mohawk kings would be there, and so the the audience started chanting the kings, the kings, the kings, and they decided to bring them up on stage and sit them on stage to be watched watching the play. So that's our introduction to Shakespeare. Make of it what you will. But I always liked that it had a long reach with us, right? But I was also interested when someone said, "Well, this was a conference framed around the Gilded Age," and I knew from growing up in Western New York how much Western New York liked looking back at the Gilded Age, right? That damn fair, I just kept hearing all the time as though I had just missed it. And I wanted to know how we went from in the mid 18th century being on the map as the country of the Five Nations to by a century later, the great state of New York, the Empire State, with us totally erased out of the picture. And I realized, when the theorist of settler colonialism, the late Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe, coldly observes that the logic of settler colonialism is the elimination of the native and their replacement. And things like genocide, it wasn't even a term yet. It's a neologism that follows the Holocaust. So genocide wasn't on the books as a program, but it was certainly being practiced. And in the midst of that, there was a more insidious way of covering up, which was to invent this myth of the vanishing Indian. And think of how insidious that verb vanishing is. Who's the agent of it? I want to know who vanished the Indians. It's not a trick we did, right? But it was part of some romantic long goodbye. You can barely see the characters from The Last of the Mohicans in this Thomas Cole painting. They're very tiny in his usual Where's Waldo Indian way, because he is much more invested in the landscape that he is busy evacuating, right? Those gorgeous landscapes I love them too, but it kind of is like an open for business Manifest Destiny advertisement, right? And you're guaranteed the last of the Mohicans, right? We're a country addicted to lasts, right? Again, Tompkins Matson from downstate, the last of the race, 1847. There are hundreds of thousands of Native people in 1847. And yet he's marooned this family against the sea, and in the title of his painting claimed them the last. I call that aspirational vanishing, right? That is not an account of what's really going on in the United States. It is a desire for that to go on. The kind of memorialization of figures like the obelisk in Auburn Cemetery in central New York, built to the character Logan, Cayuga chief, made famous by Notes in the State of Virginia by Thomas Jefferson for his native oratory, famously ends that speech, "Who is left to mourn for Logan? No one." And that is, a big monument put up not by indigenous people, but by white people, both commemorating, making nostalgic, and also marking as gone, right? It's in that world that I'm interested in their survivance, that neologism. It's a combination of the word survival and resistance. And some people don't like it. I don't care. But, the great scholar Gerald Visner came up with that, and he said, because survival sounds like something that might happen just by luck or accident. You were lucky to survive that car crash. But when your survival is an act of resistance, when it is a willful survival, damn it, I'm going to survive, that's survivance. And the survivance of, my specific ancestors in the 19th century who learned to adapt, who learned to persist, and in the best cases, flourish, is an important part of making me who I am, of making my family who they are, but also it came with all the stories of those difficult negotiations and, at times, conflicts, right? I love this photograph, this early photograph of these Tuscarora women at the brink of Niagara Falls selling their beadwork, raising their families based on the industry they created, right? These kooky little Victorian boots, I've never known what to make of them. I once was at an antique store and someone had one, and as much as I liked it as an indigenous made object, I couldn't get over its Victorianness. I have a kind of allergy there. But then, so I was thinking about, all right, the Gilded Age. Ugh. And, I always think, at what cost Gilded Age, right? Because I was so glad the show flopped, frankly. I did not want a show celebrating, mythologizing an age of what? Oh yeah, the great age of child labor. That was a really dandy one. Or, meanwhile out west, I don't know, busy with the Indian Wars, the same period. I always teach my students when we do this period, the Gilded Age for Native America continentally is the nadir of our existence. That is when the Department of Ethnology will say that by 1920 we will be extinct culturally. We'll live on biologically, but the government will have successfully taken our land, put us onto reservations, and then taken our children and forced assimilation. And I was thinking of this time period. That's Carlisle, the most infamous and the first of the Indian boarding schools in Pennsylvania, where my grandmother's father went at the turn of the century, James Bureau. Ran away, went back, ran away, went back, as so many of them did. He was lucky to survive, as so many didn't, right? Remember, every one of these schools, of which there were over 130 in the country, has a graveyard. Think of that, right? In Canada, that was hidden, and it was a big revelation when it happened, when they discovered it. It was never hidden in the United States. It was just part of it. And I asked my students, think of that fact. A school for children has a graveyard. You take your kid to a prep school, you don't say, could we see the cemetery? But this was just part of the thing, the reality of it. They'd run away, they'd freeze to death, die of exposure, they got diseases, they were uncared for, and so on. It became, this is the other side of the coin of the Gilded Age, right? I love this. So Francis LaFlèche, an Omaha Indian who went on to become an anthropologist, wrote a book about boyhood experiences in boarding school that was illustrated in that famous frontispiece by Angel Decora, a Ho-Chunk artist. We used to call them by the settler name Winnebago, but they are the Ho-Chunk Nation in Nebraska and Wisconsin. Illustrates that, you know, a new child being brought there and being consoled by a boy, an older boy now dressed like a little cadet, into that traumatic world of the boarding school. And so this was vanishing by another means. This was erasing your identity, your language, your heritage, your family ties. And it was in this context, in recent work I've been doing, that I realized that indeed Shakespeare was taught, right? Kind of weaponized, right? And you think, what do they need from Shakespeare? But the cultural capital, if we've been hearing that word, is so high that it is indeed going to be the, you know, the gold standard of white achievement, right? So I was looking at different yearbooks, different school papers, and such crazy things. In one school in Oklahoma, every day when the children stand up at roll call, they must say their name and a new line they've memorized from Shakespeare. And that's just so creepy, right? And I just think to build that in to everything they do. And in another school, a student does so well in his general performance that as a graduation gift, his name is officially changed to William Shakespeare. And he goes on to medical school. He's an Arapaho. And if you were to Google the Arapaho medical doctor, William Shakespeare, you would find this man, right, who probably wore that as somewhat a badge of honor, given the context that he was raised and grew up. But it has such a strange negative, you know, I approach it in so many vexed ways, let us say. It is not an unalloyed good to me, because I know what's been made of it and how it was used. Closer to home, the Thomas Indian School here in Western New York, in Irving, New York. My grandmother's siblings were taken from her there when her mother died. She was 14. Her mother died of tuberculosis, and she had 4 younger siblings, which the state deemed her unable to care for, even though she had an extended family on the reservation of aunts and uncles, and took away her siblings and took them here. I am proud to say that she, 2 years later, when she was 16, she learned to drive. She borrowed a car and went to visit them, to take them for a picnic, from which they never returned. And she just took them back home. Our reservation is bisected by the Canadian border. Somehow they ended up in Canada, away from the long arm of the boarding school. But this notion of, you know, kill the Indian, save the man, the notorious motto of Pratt, who founded the boarding school system, it was insidious in a way for all people, for not just Native Americans. We were a captive audience, but in many other schools as well. I don't know if you've ever seen this notorious cartoon from Puck Magazine, 1899, when the US has just conquered Samoa, Guam, the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and they're all in the front row and they're going to be Americanized by the teacher, Uncle Sam, and those are newly admitted states, now very white behind him. So there's a kind of process of blanquidad going on. In the dunce's seat at the corner by the door is a Native American reading a book upside down. So that's their comment on American education of Native people. American education of Black people, the kid is washing a window. And then standing at the door ready to come into Uncle Sam's school is a Chinese student. So you can see American imperial desires all over this thing. This is the background at which I tend to look at this. So it just takes away a bit of the gleam for me to know what's going on, to know that there were ethnographic sideshows at this event, right? People performing their ethnicity on the Medway Fair type of thing, just like in Chicago in 1893. This image, right, is exactly one of progress being replacement. Over here you have stereotypical indigenous accoutrement, a canoe, a teepee, which was never part of Buffalo, New York, and a weirdly Christianized totem pole, which was certainly not part of our tradition, being, being replaced by this gaudy neo-Baroque paste building there. At these fairs, it was very typical to have Native students recite scenes from Shakespeare to show how assimilated they had been, right? The perfect example of real progress. A Native child in a cadet's uniform saying lines. Now, I was curious, what plays did they look at? You can better believe it's not Romeo and Juliet in a boarding school. It's Caesar, Caesar, and Caesar. Boy, do they love that play. And not the kids, but their teachers, because they're afraid of all the other ones. But you would have all of these moments of discussion around that play at their schools. I am interested in what Native people now do with these plays. I was very fortunate in 2007 to see Macbeth performed at the National Museum of the American Indian in Tlingit and English. An amazing thing, right? The poster there says Macbeth, and it has a Northwest Coast mask on it, and it was like in Tlingit. I remember we were walking by that, and a friend of mine said, finally, what we've been waiting for all these years, the Tlingit Macbeth. But it was brilliantly done. It was brilliantly done with super titles in English and then the Tlingit language. But when the villains, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, spoke, they wisely had them speak their lines in English, because everything that was selfish, overweening, murderous was foreign to the Tlingit language. Everything that was communitarian, part of a general call for health and community well-being, was done in Tlingit. It also widely preserved the best loved speeches of the play, right? But it was just a great, nimble adaptation. A few years later, 2016, at a school where my brother is a professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, their students put on Shakespeare our way and did all sorts of interpretations, whether it was translating the sonnets into an indigenous language or performing a piece from an indigenous perspective. Another piece was done, not part of this, where they had Measure for Measure set in an Indian boarding school instead of a convent. And the creepy, overbearing teacher was the threat to the women, not the priest to the nuns. So there is a way of adapting to this, to taking it, to indigenizing it, to making it part of our own survivance and our own insistence that, yeah, we can do that too, right? We can find, as one of, my mother was the one, my Mohawk mother's one introduced me to Shakespeare as a kid, and like our other speaker, we had one big bookshelf in which we called grandly our library. And in our library was her, book of Shakespeare's complete plays from her 2 years of college. And we never thought it was at all something we shouldn't approach. It was the same thing. She loved it. I was taken to the plays early, some here in Buffalo, and was just fascinated by it. So I think now when I kind of put it together, I do have, as I said, some vexed associations with it. But I also see the way that Native people and other BIPOC people have been able to take it, make it ours. As my mother said, we all love good storytelling, right? And those are profoundly about the power of story, about language, and other things to move the human spirit. And so, with all those complications, Gilded Age or not, I'm glad we are still here in our homelands, spread like a constellation across that map, and that we can read Shakespeare our way. Thank you. Yahweh, go on.